I think a lot of people go to Mount Everest and be like, this is something I'm going to accomplish.
It's like the metaphor for all the goals, you know, that people have.
It's a quantifiable marker. It's just like, it just is the biggest, tallest thing.
There is this badge of honor that comes with it. And yeah, a selfie for Insta.
The summit of Everest is just over 29,000 feet above sea level. And it so happens that there is no other mountain which does top 29,000 feet.
That one simple number has attracted thousands of people willing to risk everything to get to the top of Mount Everest.
For every 33 people who make it to the top of Everest, one person dies trying. Not good odds.
There must be 50 ways to die on Mount Everest. Hypoxia, hypothermia, ice falls, avalanches, and bad decision-making.
I would die climbing Mount Everest.
I would immediately die. I have no cardio.
Most people who did climb Everest definitely did not tell their mom they were climbing Everest, because no mother would ever allow their child to do anything like that.
For 100 years, Everest has been a beacon to scientists, geographers, and adventurers, drawn to the tiny point where our planet brushes against the stratosphere.
There's something rather special about being totally alone on top of the Earth.
The dream fulfilled.
It's thrilling and exciting, immensely rewarding.
It's truly a blessing.
On the other hand, you're in the most dangerous place on Earth.
Mount Everest casts a spell across the globe. Thanks to a few numbers, Everest is more than a mountain. It's a challenge to the world, asking, have you got what it takes to conquer the big one?
Well, it's the highest mountain in the world. It's the third pole. Mountaineers seek the heights. There's something about getting to the highest point that brings you closer to God.
Mount Everest is 29,032 feet tall. Its summit is almost 5.5 miles above sea level. That's as high as 95 Statues of Liberty stacked on top of each other. It sits in the Himalayan mountain range in Central Asia, on the border between China and Nepal. About 115 miles east of the Nepalese capital, Kathmandu.
I can't help but think that some of the fascination with tall mountains has to do with a bit of phallic obsession. But I think a lot of people climb Mount Everest for the bragging rights.
Each year, more than 500 climbers, hailing from all over the world, pay an average of $45,000 to try and make it to the top.
It cost me like $3 grand to go backpacking in Japan for like 2 weeks, so like, that seems reasonable.
That's some rich people right there.
Even though you have a lot of free time and a lot of money, there's a chance to die and you sort of want to.
Until really the 1990s, to have a go at Mount Everest, it was assumed that you were a very experienced mountaineer. When I went to the mountain in 1988, I was actually the 203rd person to reach the summit.
33 years later, the mountain's been climbed by well over 10,000 people. In 2019 alone, 523 paying climbers tried to scale Mount Everest. 398 of them succeeded, along with 507 guides. 10 people died in the attempt.
Certain humans are attracted to sports and competitions that are considered particularly dangerous. And the corpses strewn up and down Everest kind of add to the cachet for some individuals.
For 100 years, human beings have been trying to climb Everest, and 288 of them have lost their lives. So why would anyone brave this peak? And how did our obsession with Everest begin? These guys are the Everest OGs, especially this guy, George Mallory, who tries to climb it 3 times in the 1920s. When he is asked why, he simply answers, because it's there.
Because it's there is not a good enough reason to climb Mount Everest.
Because it's there is kind of like the same reason my cats have for eating all the things that they're not supposed to eat.
Heroin's just there.
A lot of things are there.
So how exactly did Mount Everest get there? $50 million BC. The tectonic plate that forms the Indian subcontinent collides with the Eurasian plate, driving the rocky peaks of the Himalayas up and into existence, including Mount Everest. For the next 50 million years or so, that tectonic collision continues. So every year, Everest grows about 1/8 of an inch. That's called being an overachiever. At some point, Everest slowly became the highest point on the planet, but no one noticed for a really long time. Fast forward to 1802. British colonial influence in India is in full swing, and Mount Everest is still living in blissful anonymity. But that will soon change, because the British East India Company wants to reinforce their control of the Indian subcontinent. So they decide to map every inch of it, beginning at the country's southern tip.
This is an extraordinary feat of science and engineering called the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India. And basically, it was a way of measuring through a series of triangles.
Hundreds of people labor to create an accurate map of India, working their way 1,600 miles up the entire country, one triangle at a time.
It was the literal measurement of a line of longitude, the length of the subcontinent of India. This implied carrying the most fine instrument of the era, these theodolites that weighed 1,500 pounds. And they literally marched these incredible devices the length of the subcontinent.
42 years after they begin, the British surveyors reach the Himalayan mountain range and notice, wow, these mountains are big.
In 1846, Andrew Waugh is the director of the Survey India when the Bengali mathematician Radhanath Sikdar says, I've discovered the highest mountain on Earth, Peak 15. And it's Andrew Waugh who suggests that instead of calling it Peak 15, we should name it after my predecessor, Sir George Everest. Sir George Everest, as he apparently pronounced his name, actually rather objected to this idea. He said, well, that's not really appropriate, and there must be a local name for the mountain, which indeed there is. It's Chomolungma.
And it was his misfortune to have a mountain, the highest on Earth, named after him for all time, but also mispronounced for all time as Everest.
The mountain's stature is discovered at a key moment, just as Europeans are developing a severe case of alpine fever.
In the mid-19th century, there was a gradual change of attitude in Europe from thinking of mountains as places of horror to thinking of them as places of fascinating beauty.
By the late 19th century, climbing had been one of the things that gentlemen did. There was a fusion of literature and culture that went with climbing.
And that really reached its climax with the first ascent of the Matterhorn in 1865.
The 14,692-foot Matterhorn quickly attains legendary status among the European mountaineers.
It is a very, very striking visual object, and it has a kind of aura and fame.
When word of Everest's impressive altitude makes it back to Europe, the tweed-clad mountaineers inevitably set their sights on conquering it.
In the mid-19th century, when Westerners first realized that there were mountains reaching to nearly 30,000 feet in height, they couldn't believe that mountains could actually be this high.
The fact that Everest is 29,000 feet high, that is the equivalent of looking down from an airplane.
Everest is twice the height of the mighty Matterhorn, and presents challenges that European mountaineers can't even imagine. It's the early 1900s, and Europeans are conquering the final frontiers of planet Earth one by one. The North Pole, the South Pole, and inevitably, Mount Everest. In 1921, George Mallory of Because It's There fame goes to Everest for the first time to scout it.
George Mallory was a fantastic climber. He was also stunningly good looking, and in a way he became a symbol of the great effort on Everest.
In 1922, he returns as part of the first serious attempt to reach the summit, approaching Everest from the north through China.
The white men arrive with all their extraordinary equipment, including these steel cylinders full of oxygen. And the local Tibetan people, they are amazed, and they call it English air.
At Everest Base Camp, the air contains less than 50% of the oxygen present at sea level. At 25,000 feet, this drops to 39%. At Everest summit, the air contains only 32% of the oxygen we're used to at sea level. But Sherpas and many European mountaineers at the time are dubious about using English air.
At this stage, there's still considerable doubt, A, about whether a human being can actually get to 29,000 feet, B, whether supplementary oxygen is actually going to help.
These European mountaineers had never tested their abilities against a mountain like this one. Mount Everest challenges the very limits of human physiology.
At nearly 9,000 meters, there's so little air pressure, you've just got to extract what you can out of the air. Every step, it'd be 3 very conscious, deep breaths.
Onward, gentlemen! Forward!
The first expedition quickly finds out how unforgiving Everest can be.
They were really climbing into the unknown.
On June 7th, 1922, George Mallory, 2 teammates, and 14 Sherpa are attempting to conquer Everest.
They weren't really prepared for what they saw. They got onto the northeast ridge, and then there was a huge avalanche.
The avalanche tosses the expedition 145 feet down the mountainside. 7 Sherpa are killed in the first major climbing disaster on Mount Everest. It will be 2 years before George Mallory makes another attempt at Everest.
In 1924, many of the same team come back for a second full-scale attempt on the mountain.
George Mallory sets out once more to reach the top of planet Earth, this time with a young climbing partner named Andrew Irvine.
They sort of knew what to expect. They had all the pieces in place to actually make an attempt to climb the summit.
Mallory and Irvine leave the rest of their team at the camp, striking out along Everest's northeast ridge.
June the 8th, a member of the climbing team looks up and he thinks he sees 2 figures, somewhere possibly up on that crest of the northeast ridge. And then the clouds move back in and he doesn't see them again.
It's the last time anyone sees Mallory or Irvine alive.
And it was never determined whether or not they reached the summit before they met their end.
Mallory's disappearance was international news and remains a subject of public fascination to this day. But his disappearance into the mists of Everest does not discourage further attempts to conquer the mountain.
During the 1930s, there are 4 more attempts to try and get to that summit. And then after the war, there are more attempts because people desperately want to complete this journey.
In 1953, the British make another attempt under the leadership of an army colonel named John Hunt.
Right, here we go.
The large expedition includes Edmund Hillary, a beekeeper from New Zealand.
There won't be any bees at the top of Everest.
And Tenzing Norgay, who is a member of the climbing team in addition to leading the Sherpas.
I can help you, Edmund. Ed Hillary was very, very driven. He was intensely ambitious. It was wonderful that he was paired with Tenzing Norgay, a man who had almost got to the summit with the Swiss the year before.
Tenzing Norgay has been a porter and guide on Everest for nearly 20 years by the time Edmund Hillary arrives.
Tenzing Norgay, technically a citizen of India, but born in Tibet and also a citizen of Nepal, and was in a way a representative of the Sherpas he headed.
The 1953 expedition establishes a path approached through Nepal that is now known as the South Col route. A col is a low point in a ridge between mountains. This route winds its way up the southwest face of the mountain and is now dotted by 4 rest stops along the way, starting with Camp 1 at 19,500 feet, up to Camp 4, which sits in the South Col at 26,300 feet.
The start of the climb is up the infamous Khumbu Icefall, a great cataract of ice on the south side of the mountain. Is changing from week to week. Sections are collapsing constantly. You've got to climb through over 2,000 feet of chaotically fractured, tumbling blocks of ice the size of skyscrapers. It's just a very, very dangerous place, and it always will be.
The Khumbu Icefall is part of the 10-mile-long Khumbu Glacier, the highest glacier in the world. With its source at an altitude of 25,000 feet, moving down the mountain at an average rate of 3 feet per day. If you could stand it on end, it would be 53,000 feet tall, almost twice as high as Mount Everest itself. The 2.5-mile-long icefall is filled with towering seracs up to 30 feet high and crevasses up to 145 feet deep. It's the first major challenge on the ascent. Climbers must cross a 2,000-foot stretch of the icefall to get to Camp 1.
Part of what's impressive is all the logistics to get them there. The plans for having regular drop-off points for food, for oxygen, how they're going to get all their equipment up and down that mountain.
In preparation for their summit attempt, Hillary and Norgay must pass through the icefall several times. During one attempt, the dangers of the icefall strike. Descending the glacier, Hillary lands on an icy outcropping above a crevasse, which collapses beneath him, and he plunges towards the darkness below. Luckily, he is tethered to his climbing partner, Norgay.
And I set off down a crevasse. Well, Tenzing, who was following, had the rope tight in a very short time and pulled me up so I didn't go very far.
Tenzing Norgay's expert skills save Edmund Hillary's life, and they form a friendship that will last for decades. Hillary and Norgay are the B team on this expedition. After another pair of climbers fails to reach the peak, they are chosen to make the second try.
So we get to the morning of May the 29th. Hillary and Tenzing in this tiny little tent perched on a ledge.
What a view!
Higher than any human has slept before. They break trail up the steep snow leading to the south summit. And then they come to what is now known as the Hillary Step. And it's a sort of steep rise in the ridge. It's about 40 feet high. And finally, Hillary gets to the top of this awkward step, brings up Tenzing on the rope. Finally, there's this wonderful moment where it's a beautiful morning, hardly a breath of wind, and it's just perfect.
Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay become the first human beings to stand on the summit of Mount Everest.
In the 1950s, we have not left the atmosphere yet. We have not been to the moon. So Mount Everest at that time was the farthest or highest anyone has ever gone.
It wasn't summited as the British had imagined by Oxbridge boys. No, it was a humble beekeeper from the far reaches of empire and a Sherpa of a humble origin in the Karta Valley.
Ed Hillary was offered a knighthood. Tenzing Norgay was not offered a knighthood. It would have been nice if they'd given a knighthood to Tenzing Norgay as well.
Those two dudes worked as a team. It is not fair that only one person gets recognition.
You know the saying, behind every great white man is an Asian? That should be a saying, guys. That should be a saying.
Since Hillary and Norgay blazed the trail up Everest, 10,271 climbers have successfully summited, and 6,554 of them have done it on the South Col route. The South Col route has also paid witness to some of the mountain's other famous firsts. In 1970, Yuichiro Miura of Japan becomes the first person to ski down Everest. But Miura doesn't stop there. 43 years later, in 2013, he becomes the oldest person ever to summit the mountain at age 80. In 1975, Junko Tabei of Japan becomes the first woman to summit Everest, barely surviving an avalanche en route. And then in 1980, Reinhold Messner of Italy and Peter Habler of Austria become the first people to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. By 1980, Reinhold Messner is already a legendary mountaineer.
He's one of the best, fastest climbers in Europe. He does some extraordinary Himalayan climbs, and he is a phenomenon.
I'm the king of the world.
Messner invents the ultimate mountaineering challenge, climbing the highest peaks on all 7 continents. It becomes known as the 7 Summits. The 7 summits are Mount Kosciuszko, Vincent Massif, Mount Elbrus, Mount Kilimanjaro, Denali, Aconcagua, and finally, the gargantuan Mount Everest in Asia. Mallory and Norgay proved it was possible to reach Everest summit, but only elite mountaineers dared to attempt it. Only 4 more people made it to the summit in the 1950s, and 17 more in the 1960s.
In the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s, they were really experienced climbers, and so Everest was the pinnacle of their career.
Until one man decided to use numbers to tackle Everest. The numbers in his bank account with lots of zeros at the end.
Round about 1980, a wealthy American businessman, Richard Bass, he liked dreaming up great plans. And he thought, well, how about climbing the world's 7 highest continental summits?
Bass has only 4 years of climbing experience, but he realizes he can pay more experienced mountaineers to help him climb the world's highest peaks. Bass conquers 6 of the 7 summits in 1983, spending a whopping $125,000 US just to reach the top of Vincent Massif in Antarctica. It takes him 2 more years and 3 attempts before his odyssey concludes on the summit of Mount Everest on April 30th, 1985.
It's a bit of a game changer when this wealthy businessman says, well, I've got the money, I'll pay someone, I can get to the summit of Everest.
Help me up there, buddy.
And he pulls it off. It obviously makes people think, well, if him, why not others?
And so, it doesn't take long for commercial pressures to change who climbs Everest.
It's quite lucrative. You can charge $70,000, $80,000 to climb Everest.
It starts as a trickle, but soon becomes a flood. Between 1990 and 2005, more than 2,200 climbers attempt to summit Everest for the first time. The climbers who make it to the very tippy top, also known as the summit, will discover that it measures approximately 10 feet long by 3 feet wide, the size of a large dining room table.
Heidi-ho!
Most climbers remain on the summit for just a few minutes. On May 23, 2019, a total of 354 climbers reached the summit, the most ever in a single day. The Nepalese government wants to keep those visitors coming. They collect a fee for every climber.
So they just start dishing out these permits to more and more climbers. And that starts hundreds of people arriving every April to throng the mountain for the spring season.
These newer climbers are not necessarily accomplished mountaineers, and many of them aren't prepared for the most hostile environment on the planet. The last camp on the South Col route before reaching Everest summit is Camp 4, perched on a rocky flat devoid of life. Ladies and gentlemen, We have now entered the death zone.
I bet the death zone is where most people die when they're climbing the mountain.
A tourist attraction to go to the death zone sounds like a ride.
Not a great way to appeal to a person like me, but like anyone who drinks Mountain Dew probably loves it.
I think you need to rebrand a little bit. Maybe if you call it the pleasant zone.
The altitude above 26,000 feet is known as the death zone. The air contains less than a third of the oxygen present at sea level. The human body is using oxygen faster than it can be replaced by breathing, and simply can't acclimatize to the deficit. The chance of brain swelling increases. Digestion efficiency declines. Climbers are advised to spend no longer than 48 hours in the death zone.
It's about time I left. Been here too long.
Human beings were not designed to operate at 29,000 feet. The trick on Everest is to try and get up and down so quickly that your body doesn't quite know what's hit it.
The most important number on Everest could be the length of time your body can operate in the death zone. Because once there, you've still got more than 3,000 feet to climb to get to the summit.
Your body is just wasting away. And that's because there's just not enough oxygen even for you to keep blood flowing.
Individuals start to experience hypoxia. They're not getting enough oxygen. They experience such high blood pressure in the brain that they are disoriented and really have impacts on their decision-making skills. This is part of the danger of the death zone.
There's so little air pressure, and you really have to feel your diaphragm pulling down and desperately trying to fill the lung cavities with as much air as you possibly can. And you just become weaker and weaker. You are dying. That's what you're doing up there. You're dying.
And you're battling these symptoms in an environment that gets more hostile weather than anywhere else on the surface of the planet. The 6.5-mile layer of the atmosphere that supports all life on Earth is known as the troposphere. And above that is the stratosphere.
When you fly in a plane, you're usually flying in the stratosphere. There's almost no place on the surface of the Earth that actually reaches into the stratosphere, except for really high mountains.
The summit of Mount Everest is on the border of these atmospheric layers, which is also occupied by the jet stream, with prevailing winds that move upwards of 100 miles per hour.
Everest is in this region where it actually can be slammed by these very, very high winds.
Temperatures can drop as low as -40 degrees, with the wind chill making it feel more like -94 degrees Fahrenheit. While the overall speed of the jet stream can easily reach 100 miles per hour, bands of intensity called jet streaks can achieve speeds of 183 miles per hour.
If you're not careful, it could blow you off the mountain. There are records of people being blown off of Mount Everest. That can happen.
In 1996, the death zone unleashes its fury during a climbing season that results in one of Everest's most notable tragedies. In the early hours of May 10th, 1996, 3 expeditions leave Camp 4. New Zealander Rob Hall and American Scott Fisher lead a combined total of 33 climbers.
The goal is to get to the summit as early as possible.
If you haven't made it to the summit by 2 p.m., you're not going to make it before the sun goes down.
I think it's kind of hard for people to understand how difficult it is to climb at those elevations. And so typically, when you climb Everest, it takes you about an hour to go 100 meters.
At that pace, the final push to Everest summit is a race against the clock. In the death zone, any delay can be the difference between life and death. When Hall and Fisher arrive at the Hillary step, the fixed rope hasn't been set up, and they wait for an hour. 3 climbers return to Camp 4, fearing they will run out of oxygen on the summit.
What happens is that people don't have a lot of skill. They come to the Hillary step, and they slow down. And only one person can go up through the Hillary step at any point in time. And so what happens is the kind of backup occurs.
The 2 p.m. deadline comes and goes. Rob Hall and a handful of others reach the summit, But there is still a traffic jam of climbers below, determined to get to the top.
If this is your goal to climb Everest, you've just spent $70,000 of your money to do it, and so you're gonna try to make it to the summit.
By 3 p.m., the sky darkens and snow begins to fall. A second jet streak brings a terrifying storm. Rob Hall remains at the summit, trying to protect a trapped client. Scott Fisher is struck with altitude sickness and sends his team down without him. By 5 p.m., a blizzard hits and everyone on the mountain is in deep trouble.
Fearsome winds, whiteout conditions, driving snow in your face, and that storm blew all afternoon and continued through the night.
A lot of the people who got trapped high in the mountain were not very skilled, and they climbed essentially into a blizzard.
The death zone claims both Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, as well as several other climbers.
Well, 8 people died in that storm during those days, May the 10th and May the 11th.
At the time, it was the most fatalities in a single day on Everest.
When news of the 1996 disaster reaches the rest of the world, well, you know what they say about bad publicity.
After the great disaster of 1996, apparently, instead of bookings dropping off, bookings doubled, maybe quadrupled for the companies organizing Everest expeditions.
In 2019, a total of 398 paying climbers summited Everest along with 478 support climbers, making it the busiest season in the mountain's history.
It isn't 500 people going up over the course of 12 months. It's 500 people going up in a 6-week window.
The mountain's future holds the same problems as the rest of the world, but higher. Too many people, too much garbage, and warmer temperatures. And they're no easier to solve at 29,000 feet.
In the past, people weren't so concerned about leaving waste because they assumed that they were one of such a small handful of people who are going to be up there. That's really changed now. You have so many people going up every spring.
On average, climbers and guides generate about 26,000 pounds of waste on the mountain each year, approximately the same weight as 8 full-grown hippopotami.
Once you're up there, you're like, well, there's no garbage bin, so I guess the snow will cover it up.
Like littering, I'm not down with, to be clear, but like I get it. Like, you know, like you've surmounted a mountain, you've done a thing which everyone said is impossible. At that point, you don't care about anything.
On Everest, there's these ubiquitous blue barrels that are used for everything. So all the food goes up the mountain in the blue barrels, and all the poo comes down the mountain in the blue barrels.
These barrels weigh up to 150 pounds each when they're full, and Sherpa porters carry them on their backs for over 5 miles back down the slope. In 2019, the Nepalese government staged a 45-day cleanup operation that removed more than 24,000 pounds of waste from the mountain. And there is likely much more frozen beneath the surface. The skills and generational knowledge of the Sherpa people make expeditions to Mount Everest possible.
How many people would make it up the mountain without the help of a Sherpa guide?
My guess is that 0% of the people could make it to the top without the Sherpas. It started with Tenzing, and it goes on today. These incredibly talented people who live in the region, the contributions that they make hasn't been recognized.
The Sherpa were an ethnic group that had found their way to the Solokhumbu Valley in Nepal. They became deeply associated with the mountain. And of course, once Tenzing Norgay summited Everest, the position of the Sherpa in mountaineering lore is absolutely secure.
We suspect that people have been living in the Tibetan Plateau for 40,000 or more years.
The Sherpa aren't just skilled mountaineers. They've physically adapted to life at high altitudes.
They're going to breathe more rapidly and more deeply. Some of them are developmental, like ending up with a larger chest circumference from living at high altitude all their lives and needing larger volume in their lungs. And some of them are through multi-generational natural selection. They have a gene that allow them more efficient use of hemoglobin when they're in low oxygen scenarios.
So it's no surprise that Sherpas hold some of Everest's greatest climbing records. Cami Rita has summited Everest 24 times, including 2 successful climbs within the space of a single week in 2019. The fastest ascent from the south took just under 11 hours and was accomplished by Lakpa Jalu. Babu Shiri, who was at the summit for 21.5 hours, holds the record for the most time spent on top of Everest.
They're carrying all of this stuff up the mountain.
I think being a Sherpa guide isn't the worst job in the world.
It's like, yeah, no problem, just gonna go up and down. I do this on the daily. That is a tough job.
Everest is an important economic asset for Nepal, the 43rd poorest country in the world. In 2019, expeditions earned the nation more than $300 million, a huge incentive for the Sherpa guides to return to Everest each climbing season despite the dangers. Just how risky is it to be a guide on Mount Everest? The most dangerous industry in America is hunting and fishing, with an annual fatality rate of 144 workers for every 100,000. Sherpa guide on Everest? Between 2000 and 2010, their annual death rate was 1,332 per 100,000, 10 times greater than the most dangerous job in America. The riskiest part of Everest guide work is creating the infrastructure through the Khumbu icefall.
In 1953, keeping that icefall open was the job of an English climber. He had the expertise, and it was the Sherpa employees who helped him. Nowadays, the expeditions on Everest are largely run by the local Sherpa people.
The Sherpas secure climbing ropes, carry oxygen tanks, and a special team known as the Icefall Doctors creates a path each day through the Khumbu icefall using simple aluminum ladders.
Every day they've got to go up and readjust the ladders because the glaciers will have moved a meter or two, and that can cause these ladders to become less stable. People have to walk across these ladders with their crampons. And literally, they are just ladders, and they're pretty rickety. I wouldn't trust them, but people do it.
An average climber may have to cross the icefall 6 to 8 times during their time on Everest. But a Sherpa guide must do it 30 to 40 times each climbing season.
The more often you go up and down through the icefall, the greater the statistical odds on you being unlucky.
Of the 176 deaths that occurred on the southwest face between 1953 and 2016, 44, about 25%, happened in the icefall, making it the deadliest part of the South Col route. Of those 44 deaths, 6 fell into a crevasse, 9 were killed by a section of the icefall collapsing, and 29 died by avalanche.
The climbers always tend to die high on the mountain, whereas the Sherpas tend to die low on the mountain.
In 2014, the big disaster which everyone has always been dreading happens.
It's April 18th, first thing in the morning, and the Sherpa are working in the Khumbu icefall. Unseen above them, the glacier gives a tiny shrug and unleashes massive tragedy below.
A huge chunk of ice breaks off the western shoulder of Everest and develops into an immense, great airborne avalanche.
Probably about 15 million tons of ice, and the avalanche occurred exactly in that region of the icefall where they were working.
16 people are killed in the avalanche, 13 of them Sherpas. In the aftermath, the Sherpa community ceases work, and the mountain is closed to visitors for the year.
The disaster in 2014 was probably the worst single disaster to the Sherpa people. It did sort of highlight that they're paid very good money by the standards of Nepal, but they're doing very dangerous work to earn that money.
So the whole world is warming, and we think that's what caused the avalanche in 2014 was these hanging glaciers are becoming more unstable, and there'll be more avalanches occurring in the future.
Global warming's strongest effects occur at the extremes, and Mount Everest is no exception.
Regions like Mount Everest, which are high regions, are actually warming at a faster rate than the rest of the Earth.
Average global temperatures increased by 1.3 degrees between 1914 and 2014. In Nepal, the average temperature increase was more than twice that. Each year, the glacier coverage in Nepal shrinks 14 square miles. And when glaciers shrink, they turn into water, a lot of water.
There's a very large glacial outflow like near Everest, which is constantly growing in size as the glaciers melt. And there's a real concern that this will eventually burst through the moraine and cause a flood. There's a couple of towns downstream. So it's a really big problem.
Global warming is destabilizing the entire glacier system on Everest.
And it's coming over the hill now.
And the way they recede is the avalanche.
That makes some of the ice falls more dangerous.
Should we go back into the tent?
And when glaciers shrink, they turn into water, a lot of water.
There's a very large glacial outflow like near Everest, which is constantly growing in size as the glaciers melt. And there's a real concern that this will eventually burst through the moraine and cause a flood. There's a couple of towns downstream. So it's a really big problem.
Global warming is destabilizing the entire glacier system on Everest.
And the way they recede is the avalanche.
Some of the ice falls more dangerous. It's also revealing more of the corpses that have been left up on the mountain.
More than 200 of Everest's victims never made it back down the mountain. They remain in the world's highest graveyard. As the snow and ice recede, Everest is beginning to reveal its secrets.
When Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay finally reached the top in 1953, they do actually say, we looked around just in case there were any signs of Mallory and Irvine having been there.
For decades after his disappearance, climbers hoped to solve the George Mallory mystery.
75 years later, an American research expedition on the sloping screes of the North Face at a point a few hundred feet below the crest of the Northeast Ridge.
Can't wait. This is George Mallory. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Finds George Mallory's body, and it's obvious the broken rope tied around his waist and the bruising of his body and a broken leg, that he's been badly injured in a fall and at some stage has died alone on the mountain from those injuries.
The 1999 discovery of Mallory's body solved the riddle of his disappearance. But the question remains, if he was one of the most skilled mountaineers in the world, why didn't he survive his climb? Scientist Kent Moore believes he found the answer.
I was really intrigued by the Mallory and Irvine story. They disappeared into a cloud, essentially. And then they were never seen ever again. And so what I decided to do was go to London one day and go to the Royal Geographical Society and access the original expedition reports. I came across these pressure measurements that they had made. What the data showed is that on the day they were climbing, there was a huge drop in pressure. And the pressure drop that Mallory recorded at base camp was about the same magnitude as the pressure drops that we saw in the really bad storm in 1996, where 8 people died. So from this data, we were able to quantitatively show that Mallory and Irvin probably climbed into a really bad storm.
Numbers may solve more mysteries from Mount Everest's past, but the mountain's shrinking glaciers raise questions about its future.
The future of Everest, I think, as the planet warms, I think it's becoming a more dangerous place to go. But still, I think the magnet of Everest is a pretty profound one.
You could say that Everest is just one more sightseer's tick. It's like seeing the pyramids or the Taj Mahal. It's one of those things you do. You can't deny there's a sort of cheap thrill in saying, oh, well, here I am, I've done it. This is the summit of Everest.
So what do you guys got to say for yourselves? Thanks for the opportunity.
On the other hand, there's something rather special about being completely alone, higher than anyone else on Earth. It's a strange, mesmerizing feeling.
What's the next thing after Mount Everest when people get tired of that?
It's been done. It's kind of passé.
People are gonna start trying to conquer the moon to up the ante. Like, we're going into space, right?
We're gonna try to go to Mars.
You gotta go, like, bottom of the sea. Like, James Cameron did it, but only briefly, and he still hasn't seen even half of the weird-looking fish that are down there.
I think it'll just keep being a thing because it's been a thing for so long, and people continue to do it.